This is Anka Engineering, and I'm Herman Wiegman. This series is going to be about two things: removing and installing a new rear differential in the Jaguar F-Type, and also removing and installing a new clutch disc in the Jaguar F-Type manual. Let's get into it. This is the rear differential from a Jaguar F-Type, but it's very similar to that of a Jaguar XE, XF, F-Pace, and similar models. This particular unit is a Dana 44 Advantech with cast aluminum housing and cover. Now these units often came with an open differential or with this unit, which is a limited slip friction differential. Now this limited slip friction differential has been covered in other episodes, and it does fail. And so these units are problematic, and eventually they just reduce back to an open diff and provide no traction assistance or performance advantages to the Jaguar. So we'd like to change that. And this is a preparatory video, and a follow-on video will actually change this out to a helical automatic torque biasing differential, which is much better quality, maintenance free, and gives you all that nice limited slip advantages without the headache. Now in this video we're also going to attack the transmission, remove it so that we can replace the clutch disc. This friction disc from ATC has double springs and a lot more damping capability than the clutch disc that's in the car right now. So we'd like to use this disc that has more, shall we say, attenuation on torque pulsations so that the ride quality is better and less vibrations go into the rear of the Jaguar. Now for this job, I moved the forward jack stand as far forward as I could and still have a solid locating position. While the rear jack stands on this job, I had to place them forward of the rear cross member because that was being removed. We needed to access those bolts, so I put it just ahead. And there, unfortunately, there's a fuel tank shield that we had to miss. So this is as far backward as this jack stand can go, and that one's as far forward as that one can go. That gives you the best possibility of always having the center of mass between the two jack stands and not toppling over the front or the rear. All right? Work safely, my friends. Now this shifter here is actually a short shifter from Unhinged, Lance Hoboy, on the Jaguar forums. And he produced a great set of directions, and we'll follow those to get this shifter out of the way so we can lower the transmission. Alright, let's crack on. Alright, we're back underneath the car now. We completed the stick shift release. That's back here. Looking towards the front of the car, We have a harness on the transmission. It's clipped on and it goes up to the engine wiring harness, and there's no clip to disconnect them. So Jaguar installed these units together and applied the harness around the outside of the transmission, and it goes up into the engine harness. So we're going to have to remove these. And so we've got to get our tools out. Try not to break every clip. Okay, at the extreme rear of the transmission, behind the cross brace mount, we do have the shifter arm and a mounting point that we have to remove as well. Woo-wee! Now we're at the point in the game where we have to lower the rear of the engine and try to get the transmission off. We have three sort of jacking members in play. The first one is this engine crossbar that can limit how far the engine goes down so we don't damage any of the pipes or elements behind the engine as they rock into the firewall. So we can control sort of the back end of the engine here. Now underneath we have two other items in play. We have a floor jack underneath the rear mounting point, as well as the transmission jack underneath the transmission. So we can start lowering these elements as the transmission comes down. Ultimately it will reside on the transmission jack, and this one will come out of play, the floor jack. Alright, let's see how it goes. Well, we had a successful extraction of the manual transmission, so now we can access the pressure plate and the friction disc on the single mass lightweight flywheel. So we'll get after that. But the other part was to address the removal of the rear differential to see if both of those were capable by a home mechanic with common tools. To extract the transmission, it's a big job. Right at the edge of the capabilities of a home mechanic with typical jacks and tools. The engine did have to rock backward quite a bit. Steering rack now is loosened again. A lot of manipulation to get this engine at the right angle so that this transmission could come out of this tunnel. And there were a lot of bumps and scrapes along the way. So I've removed a bunch of the sound deadening material to make that a little easier, but it's a real tight fit, and the engine just doesn't want to angle right. It really wants to angle straight back, not pointing downward, and I think that's really necessary in order to get this transmission back in. So first half successful, second half putting it all back together, that's going to be a major challenge. But in the meantime, let's see if we can focus on the rear differential and get that out. Alright, let's crack on. Here's a look at the differential oil. A little foamy, it has been exercised. No flake, but the oil drain did have some metal paste, which is fine. Oh, I gotta get this up. Oi! Now we're at a moment of truth in the rear differential removal process. I was very concerned that we had to follow the Jaguar specific directions, which calls for the lowering of the rear subframe in order to access the two most rearward bolts on the differential. And I was thinking that maybe we could go in through the tire well, drill some holes in the aluminum body, access those bolts, and remove the differential without touching the subframe. Well, as it turns out, the subframe has already been touched. By removing the rear lower cross member, we already had to loosen two of the subframe bolts on either side, left and right. And I understand why they did this. This is to provide the subframe, shall we call it, support bolt, and giving it a location on the bottom that's well positioned such that there's no shear forces on that bolt. The bottom of the bolt and the top of the bolt are fixed to the chassis of the car through this load path. So it's smart for them to tie that lower end of that crossmember bolt into the crossmember. That's one of the primary functions of this crossmember, is to give that locating point so you don't shear the bolt off. Makes sense. So we had to lower the subframe just a little bit, get these bolts out, remove this crossmember, and then put the bolt right back in to secure the subframe back in the car. So let's take a peek at that, and let's take a peek at how much room there is behind the differential. Moment of truth here. As you can see, with the cross member removed, it was tied in here. We actually have pretty good access to the two rear bolts on the differential. There's plenty of room, about 2 inches. We may not be able to pull the bolt all the way out because the bolt might be longer than 2 inches, but we can easily loosen them enough to then let the differential move forward, and we'll extract it that way. And as we move it forward, we can loosen the bolts some more. Looks like it's going to work. I will show you the subframe bolts. Right up here are the subframe bolts reinserted on the front. The rear subframe bolts are here in the back. Okay, the next part of the rear differential removal job is to pull the two half shafts out of the rear differential. And we're going to attack that here in the independent rear suspension by essentially removing some bolts and then folding the hub and the axle half out together. And that should be just enough to pull the two axle halves out of the differential such that it can be easily removed. I kind of saved this for last because it was more important for me to figure out if all the subframe members could be dropped or the cross braces, and to see if we had access to the two bolts on the rear of the differential to make the job possible. And that's okay. So we're in good shape there. So now we can crack on by pulling out the half shafts. Let's do it.
Ta-da! That's working. And the drive shaft is out. And we didn't have to take off our nut. Score! Okay. I've been able to extract the half shafts. I put this one back in. That doesn't seem to be the problem. The problem is that these two bolts have a nut on the bottom and the head's on top, and it's not captive. So that's the reason why we have to lower the subframe, because you need to get 2 wrenches on each of these bolts to release them, and the gas tanks are in the way. You can barely access them. So we have to lower the subframe. Now that's a big job. It's a fairly large piece, but I have an idea. Behind us we have a transmission jack, or a scissor jack, that the transmission is sitting on, and that could be used to hold on to the differential, untie the subframe, lower the whole thing, loosen these bolts, and then put it all right back up again. Reinsert the bolts to the subframe, and then we could just lower this unit out. So there could be a way of me attempting to use the tools on hand in my garage to change out this differential. Unfortunately, it's a big job, and I'm not sure where the center of mass of this subframe is, and I'm not sure how many wires, how many fuel hoses, how much other stuff is flying through here. So there's a lot of risk for me to do that process. So we might have to chalk it up to learning, document the procedure, and give it to a professional. Let me think about this one for just a little bit longer before I say I'm done. Alright, let's crack on.
Wow, that's about sums up this video. It's plenty long enough, and it did include 2 major goals: the removal of the transmission from a manual F-Type, as well as the removal of the rear differential from an F-Type. So I hope you've enjoyed the content. I just wanted to give some highlights, some highs and lows on this process, or the 2 processes, to just sort of give you a feeling for how difficult or easy it was. The first challenge, particularly on the transmission removal, is the fact that there was a wire harness connected to either side of it. And I can understand why Jaguar did that. They combined the engine and the transmission together as a unit, applied the wire harness, and inserted it in the car. So it's a bit difficult for us to then remove the wire harness from the transmission to just remove that component. There's also a hydraulic line from the clutch master to slave, and where to break that and where to, which clip was the easiest to remove, that was a bit of a challenge to find. And it looks like there's 2 bleeding points on that system, one near the top of the transmission tunnel and one down by the slave unit. So there's probably a multi-bleeding process to go through to get that clutch to work well again. The third component that was really challenging was the angle of the engine. Trying to get that against the firewall and get it pointed downward so that the transmission was easier to get off. That was a bit of a challenge. There's a lot of components near the firewall there, the supposer, the cross tube that runs fluid, coolant fluid from one head to the other. It's a lot of things you don't want to break. So that was a real challenge to get that engine down against the firewall. And the 13 bolts that held the transmission onto the engine, those were actually pretty easy. You could access them all once you found where all 13 were, and they were easy to extract. Usually that's a real challenge, but on this car it wasn't. Moving on to the rear differential removal, we weren't successful in that. I stopped at the point where I realized I needed to remove or lower the subframe. That's a really big job, so I'm thinking it's beyond a common mechanic or a household home mechanic. Still have a few ideas. I'm not willing to give up on that yet. Stick around, maybe I'll try one more thing. Lastly, raising the car. Right now this car is 16 inches off the ground, and that was pretty usable. It would have been better to be 18 to 19 inches off the ground, because then, for example, the transmission could have been removed. Its bell housing is 18 inches. So you need the car at least 19 inches or so to get that transmission out. We didn't need to do that because we're only replacing the clutch, the flywheel, those components. So the transmission can stay underneath the car. But just think about that when you want to do this type of work. Does your equipment extend to that range? Great. And that just about sums it up for this video. It was a bit of a twofer. You got two goals stuffed into one big video. But I hope it was helpful, and I hope it gives you an idea of what it takes to play with your Jaguar. And remember, drive well, my friends.
4 jack stands. This one's not doing much. Car's pretty stiff.